All right, we'll go ahead and get started and people can join as they come along. I'm Steve Mitchell. I'm one of the owners of Scuppernong Books in Greensboro, North Carolina. So we're coming to you tonight from all over the country. Jenn is in San Diego, Reece is in Hawaii, and you guys are scattered out all over. This is the 8th part of a series we've had at Scuppernong Books called Carceral Country, which has looked at different parts of the carceral system in the US. The United States incarcerates more people per capita than anyone else in the world. And we wanted to have a series that looked at different parts of that. Some of those events have been online. Some of them have been in our store in Greensboro. So I want to welcome Jenn Budd and Reece Jones tonight. I'm going to give you a little introduction and we'll start there. I will be posting in chat links to their books and also links to their website as we go along. We want to encourage you to join this conversation whenever you like. You can ask questions in chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask questions as we go along. We want this to be a conversation and a conversation with you. So please feel free to participate and don't be shy. I'm going to do the introduction first, okay? Just to tell you a little bit about Reece and Jenn. Reece Jones is a political geographer who studies immigration restrictions and border violence. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, a professor and chair of the Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Hawaii, and the editor-in-chief of the journal Geopolitics. He's the author of 3 books, Border Walls, Violent Borders, and White Borders, as well as the book we'll be talking about tonight. He's published dozens of journal articles, as well as opinion pieces in the New York Times and The Guardian. Jenn Budd is a former senior patrol agent and intelligence agent with the US Border Patrol and a whistleblower. As an agent, she witnessed and participated in the cruelty, racism, and violence that is the culture of the most corrupt and unaccountable agency in the federal government. After many years of soul searching and listening to those harmed by her and her agency, she chose to confront her own racism and prejudice and tell the truths about the Border Patrol. So we have 2 people who know a lot about the subject tonight. And to frame the conversation, I want to read just a tad from Reece's book, which kind of sets the general idea of what we're talking about. In a 1947 administrative decision made without public input, the Department of Justice defined the border zone as within 100 miles of borders and coastline, a vast area that includes 9 of the 10 largest cities in the United States and 2/3 of the American population. Portland, Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Houston, Los Angeles, Miami, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. are included in that area. The entire states of Connecticut, Delaware, Florida, Hawaii, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Hampshire, New Jersey, and Rhode Island are included. So that just gives you an idea of the geographical area that we're going to be talking about, that the Border Patrol has authority over. So either one of you can take this. Just for clarity's sake, can you differentiate for us the difference between the Border Patrol and ICE, which is the other kind of immigration thing that we hear about a lot?
Well, I like to say that the Border Patrol are the gals in green in between the ports of entry, and the CBP are the kids in blue at the ports of entry, and ICE can go wherever they want, and they tend not to wear uniforms. and they are basically looking for people who are undocumented and settled within the United States. So that's the difference.
Mhm.
But they kind of can overlap each other and work in each other's areas often.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so Reece, I know you talk in your book about Portland, and you kind of use Portland in the summer of 2020 as an indication of what the Border Patrol can do and what their authority is. Can you talk a little bit about that? About
Sure, Steve.
Portland?
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me. I'm really
Yeah.
happy to be joining you and talking with Jenn about our books. I was telling Steve before the rest of you all joined that I have a lot of North Carolina connections, so I wish I was there in North Carolina. My parents live in Wilmington. I went to North Carolina, Chapel Hill as an undergrad, so North Carolina is certainly close to my heart. But aloha, I'm coming to you from Hawaii, so thanks for having me. Yeah, there are a lot of reasons that drove me to write this book about the Border Patrol. One is that 100-mile zone you were talking about, and the fact that the Border Patrol can operate so deep inside the United States, and as I describe in the book, also has a series of exceptions to the Fourth Amendment that allow them to make virtually any stop that they want in that border zone. So I was interested how they came to have that authority. But as I was thinking of writing the book, it was over the summer of 2020, and there were the Black Lives Matter protests happening across the United States, and the Border Patrol was involved in that. So you mentioned Portland specifically. I mean, over that summer, there were a series of videos of police acting inappropriately. But the ones that really caught my eye were those videos of these heavily armed agents pulling up in unmarked minivans. They turned out to be rental cars from Enterprise, and jumping out and grabbing people off the street in the middle of the night, not explaining who they are, not explaining what they're doing, throwing those people into the minivans and then speeding off with them. And so, at first people saw these videos and thought, well, maybe these were right-wing militias. You remember the Boogaloo Boys and the Proud Boys and 3%ers were showing up at the protests over that summer. But it quickly became evident that this was the US Border Patrol that was doing this. These were BORTAC agents, Border Patrol tactical units that were snatching people off the street in the middle of the night in Portland. And so it just kind of solidified in my mind that we need to understand why the Border Patrol is involved in all of these different things that seem to have nothing to do with their original purpose of patrolling for immigration crossings at the border itself. And so that's why I wrote the book, and to tell this history, to explain why there even is a Border Patrol, and then to explain how it became to be that they have this 100-mile zone that they can operate in, and then when these exceptions to the Fourth Amendment were approved in the Supreme Court, and then why they're in places like Portland today doing things that have nothing to do with immigration.
And just to clarify, the people they were picking up in Portland were not crossing the border illegally, or were not under what we would consider to be the purview of the Border Patrol, right?
Yeah, exactly. These were people who were attending social justice protests in the United States, right? These were U.S. citizens protesting against police violence, and standing up for the rights of people like George Floyd. You'll remember those protests over that summer. So, but the Border Patrol was deployed there to Portland, but also to a dozen other cities across the United States, as part of the Trump administration's efforts to control those protests, and also ostensibly to protect federal buildings. But as I describe in the book, their purview goes far beyond that, right? They have this kind of, and Jenn probably could talk more about this, but they have this vision really of themselves becoming a national police force, of filling the gap that we don't have in the United States right now, is a kind of federal police force that can operate anywhere in the country. And the Border Patrol is the closest thing to that, the largest, police force in the United States and has this vision of themselves being the people that are called for in all kinds of situations like that. Another example of that, of course, is the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas, right? I mean, that's also an event that, of course, had nothing to do with immigration or the border, but nevertheless, the Border Patrol is there and is the one involved, of course, in eventually the resolution of that event.
Jen, do you want to talk a little bit about this broad vision of the Border Patrol as the
National Police Force
or something? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that idea came from former Chief David Aguilar, and that was in the beginning of CBP and so forth. And he kind of saw the Border Patrol. He calls it like more of the Marine Corps. It's the last defense into the United States. And I think what's important about this, Reece mentioned, they've been in the LA riots. They've been called for the BLM protest, and then Uvalde. But another thing that the Border Patrol actively does in order to extend this jurisdiction or this area that they can patrol in, and then kind of go outside of immigration or narcotics enforcement into other peace officer training enforcement, is what they're looking to do, is they go to things like hurricane disasters or any kind of natural disaster. The Border Patrol is immediately there to help. And then the one important thing that I think that they have done is they have kind of cornered the market in domestic surveillance. And so when we're talking about BLM protests, or we're talking about even like inaugurations, especially the Super Bowl now, is all their security is done through CBP, and Border Patrol is a part of that too. And so even if it's just a football game, they're like, oh yeah, we love to help. We have lots of, and you think, oh, these guys are doing a great job and they're so nice. But what they're doing is they're getting you used to seeing them in your communities, and they're getting the police in those communities used to working with them. And so that has been the goal of the Border Patrol, specifically aside from CBP, but kind of with CBP at the same time, is to expand into the interior of the country. They call themselves first responders and all this other stuff. And that's their goal. And so they're going to do it in the ways that Reece was talking about, but they're also going to do it in ways that a lot of communities can't say no to because they possibly need their assistance and so forth.
More
So they're
appreciating ways.
Exactly. They get into the schools and they get into all these programs. They're in the colleges, they're everywhere. And they're just incredibly invasive in our communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it strikes me as you're both talking that, my memory of past disasters and also past periods of unrest was that this was when the National Guard got called in, right? The National Guard were the people who went to riot areas and all of that. Do you know anything about why that movement has happened? Or even, I guess part of that question, Jen, is, do certain people want the Border Patrol there because they don't operate under the same restrictions as so many other police or even military units would, in the sense of human rights and political rights?
Well, as far as the rank and file, or I would say not the rank and file, but as far as the management and the Border Patrol, they want Border Patrol and CBP officers to be doing more peace officer stuff. And the way they get away with this is after 9/11, they created these joint task force groups.
Okay.
And so in the name of national security, in the name of trying to stop another 9/11, when Border Patrol agents go and say work with some other police department in a joint task force operation like a local sheriff's department, what they have been able to do, and what has not, as far as I am aware of, and Reece might know if I'm incorrect on this, has not been challenged in court, is Border Patrol agents will take on the power and the authority of those sheriffs and those local police departments. And so we kind of have the reverse going on in Texas, where you have local police departments and sheriffs taking on authority of Border Patrol agents, or trying to take on the authority of Border Patrol agents, so that they can then become immigration agents. And so you see this kind of web that they're building with each other, where they're all working together. Their Border Patrol will supply ammunition and tear gas to San Diego sheriffs during BLM protests. They will help them make arrests. And so the lines of who can do what and who has what authority are completely blurred. And of course, the people who are caught in the middle of this are obviously going through a traumatic situation, a stressful situation, and they have no idea what's legal and what's not. And so everything should get settled in court, but what we find is basically that the courts end up deciding in favor of law enforcement because they throw up national security and all this other stuff. So they're really making it very difficult and very easy for Border Patrol agents who don't normally have that authority to then stand next to somebody who's a sheriff and then, oh, look, I got their authority all of a sudden, even though they don't have any of the training. So that's a real big issue, because there's a significant difference between Border Patrol training and how Border Patrol agents understand constitutional rights versus how civil law enforcement is supposed to understand constitutional rights. There is a difference, and the courts recognize it. Even the Supreme Court recognizes, and I don't agree with it. I think it's a wrong decision, but the Supreme Court has, I believe, decided 3 times in the past that like Border Patrol agents can use racial profiling as part of their reasonable suspicion for pulling somebody over. And so you get this blur where police departments normally have to have probable cause to pull you over, but Border Patrol agents only have to have reasonable suspicion. And so you have this going on, and everything is getting very confused, and that benefits the Border Patrol and the police.
Yeah. Reece, you want to tease out some of these differences between the way civil police have to operate and the way the Border Patrol can?
Yeah. I mean, I could talk about this for the rest of the time. So cut me off when it's time for me to stop. But a couple of things that I thought about while that discussion was happening. The first is there is a program that the Department of Homeland Security has that's called Operation Stone Garden. And this is money specifically to give to local police in order to have them second their officers over to work with Border Patrol agents. And it pays their salaries while they're on this duty, and overtime often, because they do it as overtime. And so it's very good for the agents, I mean, the police officers, to do this. So an example of this is at the checkpoints that the Border Patrol operates. So the Border Patrol has 113 different locations where they set up these interior checkpoints, right? So we're not talking about the border itself, where you're showing your passport. We're talking about 25 to 100 miles from the border in the interior of the United States, where they set up a checkpoint to check every single vehicle and ask questions about immigration status. So this Operation Stone Garden allows local police officers to also be stationed at these checkpoints. And so what happens is the Border Patrol is stopping the vehicles, asking about immigration status, but if they come across some other sort of violation of the law, then they can turn that over to this local deputy. So there are examples of this in states all over the United States, but in Arizona, for example, there are a lot of documented cases of this happening in Pima County, for example, where there'll be a Pima County deputy at the checkpoint. And so if there's a broken taillight, or someone doesn't have a valid driver's license, or any other sort of kind of local violations, get handed over, even though supposedly this is an immigration only checkpoint. So those are the examples of that blending.
Yeah, can I just clarify that, Reece, the idea that regular police departments cannot set up checkpoints and then just check everybody, that's not legal for them to do, right? My sheriff's department or my city police department, they cannot do that. They're prevented from doing that by Fourth Amendment rights.
Yeah, so there's in the year 2000, the Supreme Court heard a case, Edmond versus City of Indianapolis, about checkpoints by police. And in that decision, they said that police can set up a checkpoint, but that it has to be temporary and it has to be for a very specific purpose. So for example, they can do a drunk driving checkpoint.
Right.
So for say, 4 hours on New Year's Eve, they can check vehicles for drunk drivers, right? So it's a narrow purpose, but the Supreme Court said they cannot do general policing checkpoints where they just stop every vehicle to find things wrong with what's happening there. But what the Border Patrol is doing tends to look exactly like that, right? Like, so
the Border Patrol can do that. They are allowed to do that.
I think it's a little bit under dispute. There's a case right now in New Hampshire that's questioning this. It's Druniak versus Customs and Border Protection. And so that it's a case challenging their checkpoint in New Hampshire. Because if you look at, Jenn mentioned the Supreme Court cases and racial profiling, and that's the bulk of what my book is about. I tell the stories of those cases and kind of get into the Supreme Court justices and what they were thinking when they were doing these decisions. And so I can definitely talk about that racial profiling. But the last of those key cases was in 1976, which is Martinez Fuerte versus United States. And so this case allowed Border Patrol to set up immigration checkpoints, but the ruling is very narrow. It says they can only be about immigration, right? So in 1976, they weren't doing drug enforcement, right? So that wasn't one of the things that the Supreme Court considered. So the current way that they're operating these checkpoints, one, having local police there, but two, searching for drugs. They use dogs, for example. A lot of celebrities have been caught at these checkpoints. Snoop Dogg, Lil Wayne, Willie Nelson, Fiona Apple have all been cited for drug violations, having not left the United States by the Border Patrol. But they also have radiation sensors at these checkpoints where they're supposedly checking for dirty bombs. The 96-year-old governor of Arizona, Raul Castro, had recently had radiation therapy for cancer and was passing through a checkpoint north of Nogales and set off these sensors and was forced to stand in the sun for 30 minutes while they searched his vehicle for a dirty bomb. So they're doing a lot of things beyond what their 1976 Supreme Court authorization says and what City of Indianapolis said from the year 2000. So I think the Druniak case is an interesting one that's questioning the way that they're using the checkpoints today.
And Reece, and I want to get Jenn's thoughts on this too, but you write in your book a bit about kind of the Wild West beginnings of the Border Patrol, which sounds very Cormac McCarthy-ish. And do you want to talk a little bit about that? And then Jenn, I want to ask you if that is still like a perspective, a thing that goes on in Border Patrol.
Yeah, sure. So the first third of my book is thinking about this early history of the agency. I think if the audience is going to remember one thing from this is that the Border Patrol has not always existed. We tend to think of the U.S. as always having had immigration restrictions and always having had a Border Patrol to enforce those things, but neither of those are true, right? The United States didn't have any federal immigration restrictions until the 1870s, so 100 years after the Declaration of Independence, and those were intended to keep out non-white people, right? The first immigration rules were Chinese Exclusion Acts in the 1870s and 1880s. The Border Patrol wasn't created until 1924. In 1924, the U.S. passed a very restrictive immigration law based in eugenics. The committee that wrote the law had a eugenics agent on staff who provided them with the latest eugenics research to frame their writing of this law. And that law banned all Asian immigration to the US and put very small quotas on everywhere except for Northern Europe, right? So the goal of that law was to move American immigration back to Northern Europe. The headline in the New York Times as that law passed was "America of the melting pot comes to an end," right? And they were explicit that they wanted to keep the racial type in place. The Border Patrol was created 2 days after that law was passed. So it very much was founded as a racial police force. less than 100 years ago. In terms of the Wild West origins, I tell a number of stories in the book about these early characters, but many of them were drawn directly from frontier law enforcement. When you're working on a book like this, you look for that kind of character or story that illustrates the argument that you're making. And for me, it's in the person of Jefferson Davis Milton, who is the very first Border Patrol agent. He, prior to that, worked as a deputy in Tombstone, Arizona, just after the shootout at the OK Corral. After that, he was a mounted Chinese inspector after the Chinese Exclusion Act to find Chinese people in border cities and remove them. And then he was hired as the first Border Patrol agent. Of course, his name, Jefferson Davis, he was named after the president of the Confederacy. His dad was the Confederate governor of Florida during the Civil War, good friends with Jefferson Davis, and he named his son after him, right? So that kind of identity of the first Border Patrol agent, I think, illustrates that frontier Wild West aspect, but also that racial police force aspect of the Border Patrol.
I think it's also important to note that Jeff Milton is celebrated on the CBP website as the first Border Patrol agent. And CBP neglects to mention that his father was of the Confederacy and that his family owned over 50 slaves. And the reason why Jeff Milton left at the age of 15, left Florida and went to Texas was because Texas was in this fight about slavery and so forth. So, yeah, the Border Patrol's history is all based in white supremacy, like a lot of our law enforcement agencies are. And I would say that today, when we look at the Border Patrol, obviously it's more modern, it's got surveillance, it has all these laws, it has attorneys and all this other stuff. But unfortunately, what the culture of the Border Patrol is still that of this kind of Old West mentality. And you can kind of see that in these Border Patrol critical incident teams that I came forward about how the Border Patrol use these illegal and unauthorized, even unknown to Congress teams to be on the scene of shootings and stuff as soon as that happened and get rid of evidence. Not a single Border Patrol agent has ever been held accountable for killing somebody on duty in 98 years. It's not to say that every shooting is a bad shooting or that every officer is doing or every agent is doing something wrong, but the fact of the matter is after 98 years, there's going to be some bad guys in there. And so I look at the fact that just went through the hearing with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights with the Anastasio Hernandez Rojas killing that happened in 2010. And the United States under the Biden administration showed up and basically said, well, we gave them a bunch of money. What more do you want us to do? That's all we have to say. And that was it. And I don't have a lot of confidence in Congress actually holding hearings like they said that they wanted to do on these Border Patrol critical incident teams. I believe that because CBP Commissioner Magnus said, oh, I'm going to get rid of them, in reality, what he did is he just changed them to CBP under Office of Professional Responsibility, which is like internal affairs for Border Patrol and CBP. So he took this illegal unit, made them legal, and then just put them over here. I don't even think they're leaving the actual buildings that they're working in. They just renamed them, made them legal. That's the end of it. So I think in your question, is it still like that? Well, yeah, nobody's ever being held accountable for anything. Nobody's been held accountable for child separation. Nobody has been held accountable for, for all these Border Patrol pursuits that end up questionable. And so the culture is still the same, but they have more money, they have great and new modern weaponry and all sorts of things at their disposal and surveillance. So it's kind of scary right now because you have an agency that feels that they are above the law and that they do not have to answer to anybody, and that the laws that they enforce allow them to violate constitutional rights of not just migrants, and yes, migrants do have constitutional rights, but also of American citizens as well.
I want to stop for a second and see if there are any questions or comments out there. We want to give you a chance to talk to Jenn and Reece, or to ask questions as we go along. Just unmute yourself and chime in if you want to.
I'm curious what everyday citizens can do to try to continue to support folks who are, you guys are out there having these really difficult conversations in a public sphere against a tide of misinformation. How can we help? I find myself embattled in conversations that start with, well, as long as they come here legally. I'm the great granddaughter of Mexican immigrants. I can tell you my family did not come here legally. There wasn't a process in place. And when I watch what's happening at our southern border specifically, I can't help but see my family there. So do you have any thoughts or ideas? And I what I really want is for you to tell me the one, magic button thing that would fix it all. And I know if you had it, you'd be doing it. So what can I do as someone who can plug away at something every day until we finally effect a change?
Well, number one, I always say that a robust and humane asylum system is actually essential to national security. And one of the issues I have, especially with, Republicans, they know where they stand on immigration. I like that about them. I know where they are on immigration. Democrats, I don't know where they are, because when they're running for office, they're all like, they say all these great things. We're going to get the asylum system going. We're going to make it, fair. We're going to, stop making the Border Patrol have to be asylum officers because they're not asylum officers and they shouldn't have to do this. And it's like, say all this, and then they get into office and they turn right around. And I think it's very important that we demand of all our leaders, not just leaders on the border, not just Republican leaders, but like to have an actual immigration plan or policy. We definitely, I think the immigration laws are way overdue for a rewriting and a revisiting and so forth. So I think pushing your representatives on that is very important. Reece, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I wish there was a silver bullet to solve these issues, but I don't think that there is. And I think, one of the troubles that people on the left have is that we tend to describe these things in the complexity that they are. It's a complex issue. They're not simple solutions. Whereas on the right, it is simple, right? For them, it's build a wall, stop illegal immigration, right? Remove these people from the country, right? So it's a really clear message. The border is open, it's dangerous, drugs, violence is coming across that border, and we got to stop that, right? And until we stop that, we can't do anything else. And so it's the simplicity of that message, right, of Trump's build the wall, right, as a solution to every single problem, is the challenge I think that we face, is that the messaging on the right on immigration is just clearer, I think, than what we tend to talk about on the left. What can we do? I mean, I think there are a series of things to talk about. One is to just make people aware of the size of the border zone, right? I mean, it's 100 miles from borders and coastlines that the Border Patrol operates. And I think a lot of people don't realize how much it affects American citizens, right? So if you're trying to speak across to people who might not be receptive to questions around immigration, the Border Patrol affects everybody, right? I mean, they are affecting the rights of American citizens every day. In a recent report about those checkpoints, it said that 50 million vehicles pass through internal Border Patrol checkpoints every year, right? That's a huge number of people who are having their constitutional rights, their Fourth Amendment rights to be free of unreasonable search and seizures violated by the Border Patrol, because every vehicle that goes through there is briefly seized. Right, that's a seizure. It's a brief seizure of your vehicle to ask you questions. That's what it says in the Supreme Court ruling about it. And so it's a seizure of your vehicle briefly to ask you questions. And so it's a violation of our rights. And I think that emphasizing that way that it affects American citizens, I think, is one method to kind of raise this question, right? And in terms of what a solution would look like, well, one thing could be to shrink that 100-mile border zone. As I talk about in my book, that is not in the congressional authorization. There is nothing that says that the border zone has to be 100 miles from borders and coastlines. All it says is a reasonable distance from the border. And so that the 100 miles was just an administrative decision taken in 1947 without any input from the public to set it at 100 miles. So the Department of Homeland Security could revise that today, right? They could start a process to change the definition of that border zone and to shrink it much closer to the border. The Border Patrol's own data shows that 58% of apprehensions happen within 1 mile of the border, right? So maybe a reasonable border zone is 5 miles from borders and coastlines instead of 100. That's an immediate change that could have impacts on the Fourth Amendment rights of citizens, but also on migrant deaths, right? So, why are people dying in a tractor trailer near San Antonio? They're doing that because they're trying to get out of that 100-mile zone. Why are people trekking 70 miles through the deserts of Arizona? They're doing that to cross the border, but then also get past these checkpoints, right? So the deaths that we're seeing at the border are directly attributable to that 100-mile zone. So there are a series of ways that shrinking that zone could have an immediate impact and positive impact for American citizens in the borderlands and for the lives of people trying to migrate.
Reece, kind of moving from on Leanne's question, we've done another whole series on immigration a year or two ago, and you're an expert on borders, right? Is there anyone in the world who does borders well? Is there any place in the world where the immigration system is moderately humane and effective?
That's a good question and a tough question. I think the Constitution of Ecuador recognizes the right of all human beings to move. So I'd say that that's one example of another country that has a better, a more progressive way of thinking about these issues. But I recognize that a lot of countries are gripped with nationalism right now, and tend to see the world through the lens of nationalism, of the idea that their group of people should be privileged over other people around the world. And what I try to emphasize in my work is that that hasn't always been the case, right? The idea of these strict restrictions at borders is a really new idea, right? The concept of having everyone have a passport in order to move between different places is a 20th century notion, right? It's something that would emerge during periods of war in Europe, but would fall away afterwards. It wasn't until after World War I that in Europe it was common to use a passport to travel. The United States didn't require passports to enter until after World War II. So the notion that we have a global system of exclusion and restrictions on movement is a very new thing. And so I would emphasize, although right now we're certainly moving towards more restrictions, and the notion is that countries should do more and more of this, building walls, putting up restrictions, using violence at borders to stop people from migrating, that doesn't have to be that way. It wasn't that way in the past, and we can certainly envision a future world that doesn't look like that.
Anyone else have a question out there? If you're shy, you can put your question in chat.
I had my hand up earlier.
Hi, Carol.
Hi. That sort of didactic, like, that's it, build a wall, don't let anybody come. My knee-jerk reaction to that is, do you eat? Because, we lived for many years, and I taught in Watsonville, California, which is agricultural, and it's the strawberry capital of the whole United States, along next to what they call the salad bowl of the Salinas Valley. And we had a situation where they called it the redadas, the raids. And, sort of the social order in the community is the church and then the schools. And the Border Patrol agents lied. They knocked on doors of houses and said they were from the schools. So people opened their doors. And they snatched people, and children came home and the adults were gone. And they did it throughout the community, and created this huge fear because you were supposed to be able to trust the schools, but they were lying to say that they were from the schools. And, and these are people who work outrageously difficult jobs and long days and everything else to feed America. And, and when people say they're taking our jobs, well, we always drive around and say, I don't see any white people in line to work in those fields. They wouldn't, Paul Ryan wouldn't last half an hour. Forget Ted Cruz and George, and Donald Trump. They wouldn't last half an hour trying to work in the fresa and the mora and everything else. And so that's just, that's a problem that we experienced that was very terrible for people. So
thanks, Carol.
I mean, one small clarification. My guess is those probably were not Border Patrol agents knocking on those doors. Those would be ICE agents today. Those would have been INS agents prior to 2003, rounding up people in the interior is my guess on that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the one thing that is very clear from research by scholars, economists, sociologists, looking at the impacts of immigration on the United States, it's uniformly positive, right? The United States can always take more immigrants, and when it does, those immigrants contribute to the economy. Studies of immigration to the US in the past have showed that for each new immigrant who comes to the US, they create 1.2 additional jobs in addition to the one that they're doing. And if you think about that, it makes sense, because they are not just working in their community, but they're also going to the grocery store, they're renting an apartment, they're taking the bus, they're, buying clothes, they're going to the convenience store, right? And all of those things contribute into the economy of those places. In terms of the notion that the right wants to completely stop immigration, I think probably some of the kind of racist, fascist right really do want that. But I think others on the right, really what they want is to create a compliant immigrant groups, to make it difficult to come here, so people who do make it are not going to complain about bad conditions, are not going to complain if they don't get paid the right amount, are going to be willing to work even in really bad conditions, right? So I don't think that that at the business level that there really is that desire to completely stop immigration. Instead, it's a desire to make it a compliant workforce that's not going to complain, which to me is even more morally wrong, right? I mean, so there are lots of ways that those need to be improved.
And we should say that just the general terror of our immigration system helps to create that compliant, fearful, group of people. Michelle, you have a question.
Hi. Yeah, hi. I've been hearing all of you guys, and I thought it was really funny because when Reece mentioned Ecuador and the immigration system that we have here, because we have a policy of open borders. It's really funny when he said that, because I'm right now like talking to you from Ecuador, and my biggest question from you is that how can you have a good immigration system in the US? Because my dad is American, and the immigration system just become an American was hell. And that was a problem, even though my dad is American. So it made no sense. I remember even in the US, they were like, prove she's your daughter. And he was like, what? Of course, she's my daughter. But how can you have effective border control, but at the same time, a humane one? Because the problem with borders here in Ecuador is that we do not have even a border, meaning we do not have effective control. And during the COVID-19, transnational organized crime pretty much skyrocketed. And because of that, we have drugs like crazy, urban violence, and human trafficking and smuggling. So what's your advice on you guys, or well, in the US, you have tough border laws, but at the same time, the world has other countries like Ecuador that have no sovereignty whatsoever in their borders.
Well, I think Jen and I are probably going to disagree on this because I tend to have a more of a view that we should have relatively open borders, right? I mean, that people should be able to move freely from one place to another. And if they could do that, then smuggling wouldn't be necessary, right? I mean, the reason that we have smugglers is because there are restrictions on movement, right? And there are restrictions on the ability to get from one place to another, right? So if there's no restrictions in place, then there's no need to smuggle people across a border. So I would suggest to you that there should be a fundamental human right to movement, that one of the things that we should protect at a global scale is the equal right of human beings to stay where they are, but also to move to other places if they want to. And that the future world that we're envisioning should include that as one of the things that's protected. The idea that individual groups, what we have today, nations or countries, should be able to use violence to restrict the movement of other human beings. To me, that's morally wrong. It's a morally wrong thing. It's something that should not be supported. And that in the future, I think people will probably look back on our era and think of borders as one of those things that they can't believe we abided by, that we thought of as something that was normal, that we should restrict movement at these places, right? So that's my take on it. I know I've heard Jen say that she's not necessarily a completely open borders person, so I'm interested to hear what her take is.
I mean, ideological wise, I mean, I get it and I understand that point of view, but I also have seen what is coming across the border at the same time. And although I would say 99% of the people that I apprehended were obviously not criminals, there are some obviously that are, and there are instances of where we do need law enforcement in between the ports of entry. And I just don't think that our society right now is gonna support that. I think we could work towards that. And so I think what she's talking about and she's seeing here in Michelle is talking about and seeing in Ecuador, and we see it in all the other countries. I was just watching video of Chiapas in Mexico, where you see police officers are tasing and beating the shit out of this Haitian guy. And it's just what we do here on our border. Border Patrol does to migrants all the time. It's exactly what they did to Anastasio. And so I think that there is this idea that it's an all or none thing, closed or open. And I think we could have something in between where we have an open asylum system that is robust and humane. And you have to understand that a lot of the decisions, a lot of the laws that the US is pushing is because of money. They're pushing it because they're making money out of detention. They're pushing it because they're making money out of transport and then those people who are making money out of that turn around and give to politicians on both sides. And even the surveillance technology and all this. So it's a giant money-making machine, just like, the war on drugs and the war on terrorism and everything. This border wars thing is the next big moneymaker for a lot of these defense contractors and so forth. And there's a lot of power to be had in all this. But at the same time, there's as much money to be made in a humane asylum system, where instead of detaining people, we help them get situated into their new areas, their new communities. We help them connect with, whether it's finding the right school or finding a job, English as a second language, all these things that are needed for families and so forth, because the demographics of when I was an agent have dramatically changed to now. When I was an agent, asylum seekers were every now and then. Now it's predominantly who's coming across, and there will always be people coming across illegally. But the point is this attitude of using law enforcement to handle what is a humanitarian need is incorrect. And so we have to create this humanitarian with a little bit of law enforcement to do the checks and stuff. You get the majority of people then going to the ports of entry because they want to be inspected. They don't want to cross the deserts. And then the Border Patrol isn't overwhelmed. And then the people that they're actually catching tend to be more criminals instead of moms and dads and things like this. But as far as what Michelle is talking about, this is a giant, giant apparatus that the United States is pushing south, and you see it going into Mexico. Mexico is just like the United States now in immigration, and it's going into Guatemala, and it's going into Honduras and everywhere else. And it is messed up. And as far as what you're talking about with getting your citizenship, Michelle, I would definitely say that's one of the things that I'm talking about is like the laws that you're faced with that when you're trying to get citizenship through your father. Those are very, very old laws, like what Reece is talking about, and they don't necessarily apply to how we are living today. So you're exactly right. We need to work on changing those laws, making them more humane and making them fit our lifestyle and what we've become now.
Jen, I don't want to go before you kind of tell your story about being a border agent and then deciding to blow the whistle and deciding to move in a different direction. Do you want to talk about that for just a minute?
Well, I mean, I graduated Auburn University in 1993, and I wanted to go to law school, was considering being a civil rights attorney. I would say I was probably middle of the road, not super far left, not super far right. Raised in Alabama, born in North Carolina, Winston-Salem. And I joined the Border Patrol not knowing what it was. I had never heard of it, being in Alabama, and then I was sent to San Diego. And I mean, I liked the hiking. I liked working up in the mountains. I got one of the hardest stations there was. I was the only woman there at the time, and it was very sexist and misogyny, you know, all that stuff that goes into being in police work and being a woman in police work. But the more and more I worked and I understood the system of it, you know, and this is what gets to me is Leanne was talking about what could we do. If you notice what the Border Patrol and what the far right talk about a lot is they talk about the individual agents. And I would like people to start talking about the policies and the system of the Border Patrol, because to pick on individual agents is just ridiculous. Nobody joins the border. A few people might join the Border Patrol and say, I want to kick some ass and knock some heads together. But most of the people joining the Border Patrol really are trying to defend their country, and they're coming probably from the right side and so forth. And so what I recognized in the Border Patrol was, unfortunately, that the system of the Border Patrol, whether we're talking about how migrants are treated or what the agents are ordered to do, or child separation, or any of this stuff, I would like us to start talking about these systems, and because what I recognize is the system is corrupt. The system is so rigged in favor of Border Patrol agents and law enforcement. They do not even consider migrants' testimony. They do not listen to anybody else about the border. And frankly, Border Patrol agents have such a high rate of corruption and a whole lot of criminal agents going on. And then the problem is the agents in management who are willing to overlook it the other way, they promote each other and promote each other and promote each other. And it just hurts the agency in the long run, even if you're there trying to do the right thing. And I finally got to the point where I knew the boss of my station, Campo Station, was the one organizing the smuggling of narcotics into San Diego County, and I began an investigation on them when I was at Sector Intelligence, and they gave me a choice: take a promotion and shut the fuck up, excuse my language, or you know, we're going to shoot at you and you're going to end up dying, which is what ended up happening to me. As I got shot, but I fortunately got shot at and fortunately escaped by my own fellow colleagues who were trying to report the corruption and the drug dealing and so forth that was going on. And I just couldn't do it anymore. But I ended up kind of like hiding out for like 14, 15 years, trying not to deal with the things that I'd seen and done in the Border Patrol. And it finally caught up to to me in a massive suicide attempt. And so that started me to look at my own actions, not just to point my fingers at the Border Patrol or Border Patrol agents or whatever was done to me in the Border Patrol, but to look at myself and say, what is my part in this? And what do I think about immigration? Do I think this is right or this is wrong? You know, and why do I feel that way? So that's kind of the gist of my story.
Thanks, Jen. We have a question from Andrea.
Hi, I'm from Ecuador too, and I was wondering, Jen was talking about that we have to achieve this law enforcement, but here in Ecuador, we have, our constitution has like 99 human rights that it warranties, but actually all the institutions, it makes it difficult. I worked for like 2 years in Hayas that works with refugees and migrants, especially Venezuelan migrants. And I saw from the first hand that it was really, really difficult for them to achieve all this horrible process in order to make this legal migration. So in like colloquial words, how we put like our money where our mouth is. Because something is yeah, we warranty 99 rights, but in reality, that's not happening. And what we can do to really enforce those rights.
Reece?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a difficult question, right? I think that's where we all find ourselves right now, is faced with knowledge of what a world should look like, constitutions that guarantee particular sets of rights, but then not having those rights necessarily protected in practice, right? And I think that's a challenge. I have to admit, I'm not an expert on Ecuador. I just know that the Constitution guarantees those rights, and so it's so interesting that two of the people here are from Ecuador. That's never happened before. So you all would know a lot more than me on that specific topic. But let me describe the world this way, right? So many of us live in the United States right now, right? The United States has over 330 million people that are living over like a range of like more than a quarter of the Earth's surface, right? From where I am in Hawaii, up to Alaska, to Florida, to Puerto Rico, to Maine, right? It's a vast section of the Earth's surface that already has free movement, right? We are allowed to move freely over that vast area. You know, we can become citizens of a particular state. I live in Hawaii right now. I pay taxes in Hawaii. I follow the laws in Hawaii. We have strict gun laws in Hawaii. You can't have guns in the same way as the rest of the United States. We pay higher taxes than in a lot of other places. You follow those rules, but you have the freedom to decide to leave that. I could go move to Texas tomorrow and I could become a citizen of Texas. I follow the rules of Texas and abide and pay taxes in Texas. I would suggest if we can already have a system like that working in an area that is 330 million people, a large section of the Earth's surface, we can look towards a system like that globally that would work in a very similar sort of manner. You can see the same sort of thing, I think, in the interior of the EU in terms of free movement between the different countries, the ability to live and work in any of them. So the model for what a future world could look like is already there, right? The problem is that both of those systems today, the United States and the EU, have allowed free movement in the inside, but strictly restricted on the edges of it, right? So what we need to envision is a world where we have that same sort of freedom of mobility at a global scale.
Reece, would you say that you think that, you know, when you're talking about the EU and you're talking about the United States, you're talking about predominantly countries that are more well off and perhaps predominantly white, and then the people who are on the outside that get the restrictions, possibly that's the issue. We're talking about countries that don't have the same access to goods and services that we and a lot of these European countries do. And then also we're talking about the fact that the people who are trying to get in, the majority of them are people of color as an issue as well. Would you agree with that?
So, I mean, I think that's an accurate description of the current situation, but to say that that then justifies having restrictions at borders would essentially be saying that we should abide by the racist views of some of our residents, right? To restrict movement at those places. And also that the spoils of a system of colonial exploitation and capitalist exploitation since then should be allowed to accrue in these particular places at the expense of other places around the world, right? So really, we're living in a very privileged position, and we're closing off access to those privileges through movement restrictions. A more just world would allow that sort of movement. Just in terms of global movement, though, what that would look like, there have been some surveys done about how many people would move if they could globally, and it was like 13% of people in the world. So yeah, there'd be a lot of people moving, but that's nowhere near most people in the world, right? So I think the types of disruptions that people imagine in terms of global migration are not as dramatic as they think, right? Most people would prefer to live in the place where they currently live. That's where their language is spoken. That's where their family is. That's where the foods they're familiar with are. Maybe they'd like to go work for a period of time in another place, but they'd probably want to go back to where they were from before. So I think we should look towards a global system that enables that.
I think that's interesting. Thanks. I just realized when you put it in the context of like the EU and the United States and how we can move around, I'm like, wait a minute. And so, yeah, that really helped me kind of understand what you're saying. Yeah.
And even in the United States, for example, they're quite dramatic wealth inequalities even within our country, and that doesn't send people moving as much as you might expect, right? I mean, the average income in West Virginia is like half of the average income in Maryland, right? Those two states are right beside each other, right? So it doesn't produce a mass exodus from West Virginia into Maryland, right? So some people still decide to live in West Virginia, right? So I think the notion that having freedom of movement would result in this fundamental mass movement around the world, I think is overblown. Certainly a lot of people would move. It'd be different than it is today. But I think then after that, people would settle into where they are.
Thanks.
I want to make one more question possible if somebody's out there with one they want to ask. I'll give you a minute.
Corey Johnson, you're thinking very hard, Corey Johnson. I can see you there.
Not at all. Not at all.
Michelle, you have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question, especially for Jenn, because of your background. So the Sinaloa cartel has a direct trafficking route to Chicago. My question for you, because my expertise is transnational organized crime. Agents at the U.S. border, normally they get bribed or they get blackmailed by these cartels. That's one of the biggest questions for me, because I remember I passed once Rio Grande with my dad, exiting and entering the US when I was a little kid, and they checked everything, and I remember it vividly. So the only possible way to enter the US is by having really awful agents at the border or being blackmailed or bribed.
Yeah, so the vast majority of narcotics that come into the United States are coming through the ports of entry, or they're coming, through the airports. And that's not to say that there's not drug trafficking in between the ports of entry. There is, but just not compared to the ports. And frankly, I don't know if CBP's hiring standards are as bad as the Border Patrol is, but in the Border Patrol, they'll hire anybody. I mean, they just keep lowering their standards more and more. Honestly, I mean, they've actually hired. They had the chaplain of Tucson sector was a Border Patrol agent for almost 20 years. And he was arrested when he was a juvenile for sexually assaulting and raping a child. And guess what? Even his chaplain of Tucson sector, raping and abusing children still. And they hired him and he did it. And then he became the chaplain of that sector. So they have a really, really, really poor level of background checks for at least the Border Patrol, not as good as they should have, I believe, for CBP as well. And frankly, you know, the cartels will tell you themselves. What's his name? Luis. He does a lot of reporting here on the border. I can't remember his last name. Gosh, but at any rate, he does a lot of cartel reporting. And he's talked to them, and they're like, you know, these guys, they like the young girls or they like the children, and that's all it takes. And it's usually sex or money. And fortunately, I think also the internal affairs mechanisms for CBP and Border Patrol, they are woefully inept. They're made up of former agents. So a lot of the cases that go before the Office of Professional Responsibility and the Office of Inspector General, which are the two agencies in charge of oversight of the Border Patrol and CBP and corruption, they're both made up of a lot of Border Patrol agents. The head of OPR investigations is a former Border Patrol agent. And what we say in the Border Patrol is we bleed green. And so what that means is a Border Patrol agent, always a Border Patrol agent, although I'm obviously not like that. But the majority of them are, and they will defend the Border Patrol. Honor first in the Border Patrol, that's their motto. It actually does not mean honor first to the Constitution. It does not mean honor first to the laws of the United States. What it actually means to Border Patrol agents is honor first to the Border Patrol agency and to each other. That's what it means. So the agencies themselves have a culture and an ideology that puts them above the law. And that's how they start to get into it. And then they have rigged the system that does the accountability so that they can't hold them accountable, and they get away with it more and more and more. More agents see that, they get into tight situations, whether it's financial or whatever, they make bad choices, they fall into it. And the Border Patrol and CBP don't like to talk about it, and they don't like to air their dirty laundry. So it's a serious problem. It's a serious problem we have right now.
Reece, do you have a last word for us before we go away?
Not really. I just thank you for hosting us and having Jenn and I together, and thanks for all of you for joining us. You should go buy Jenn's book. It's an excellent look at what the Border Patrol is actually like right now. So it's told with power and heart and really well written. So I highly recommend it.
Yes, I was all involved in the conversation and didn't post the links. So there's a link in chat for Jenn's book. And here's—
And I have read Reece's book, and it is also excellent. I actually learned quite a bit from it. So
I'm going to stay here for just a sec while
and I'm doing the Audible for my book right now. So if you prefer Audible, it should be out in the beginning of next year. So
yeah. And